Olá a todas e a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos para a segunda tarde do nosso evento, da nossa 21ª International Accounting Conference e do 18º Congresso de Iniciação Científica em Contabilidade da Universidade de São Paulo. Eu gostaria uma vez mais de agradecer aos nossos patrocinadores, a PwC Brasil, Gen Atlas, KPMG, Concefaz e Traders Club. Nessa tarde, nós temos a honra de receber o professor Simon Cadez, who will speak about Management Accounting Research. Professor Simon Cadez is Director of the Institute of Accounting Auditing at the University of Ljubljana. He teaches several courses related to management accounting. His main research interests are strategical management in the corporate context, corporate strategies to mitigate climate change, and control systems in higher education. Simon also has extensive administrative and new academic professional experience. To moderate this presentation, we invited Professor Andson Braga Aguiar, who is Associated Professor and Director of the Internationalization Committee of the Accounting and Actuarial Department at University of São Paulo, Course Director at FIPECAF. Professor Andson works in the line of research in controllership and management accounting. He researches topics in management control and performance management systems, with an emphasis on their behavioral impacts. Professor Simon, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for this kind introduction and also for the invitation to be part of this Congress. I was really hoping to visit Brazil in person, but unfortunately this is not possible this year, but hopefully the opportunity will present itself some other time. So what I will do now, I will start sharing the screen because I will show you the slides. So please just wait a second. And can someone please confirm that you see the slides now?
Yes.
Excellent. So for some reason, the full screen mode does not work now. Oops. Honestly, I don't know why not. So I just with not putting this into full screen mode. So today I will talk about climate change mitigation, about the role of corporations in this process, and about the role of management accounting in this process. I have put this presentation into 5 sections. So firstly, I will talk briefly about climate change mitigation and the role of corporations. This part or this section is based to a significant extent on a presentation delivered by Johan Rockström, who's a natural scientist, and he delivered a wonderful presentation at the EAA conference 2 months ago, so European Accounting Association conference, and I found his slides very informative and also, as you will see, to some extent worrying. The remaining 4 sections are my own research in the area of climate change mitigation. So I've been involved in this research for some 15 years now, I suppose. And some of the sections are my past research, whereas some of the sections are my current ongoing research that hopefully will be published in the future. Okay, so to start with, we are now in an age that is often referred to as Anthropocene. Anthro coming from Greek for human, although technically we are still in the age of Holocene that started some 12,000 years ago after the last major ice age. Because of the changes that mankind has done to this planet, we refer to the last, say, I don't know, 50, 100 years as Anthropocene. And what we have done to our planet is represented on pictures that you see here. So we have built up enormous cities that have 20 or more million people. We have built up enormous amounts of highways, railways, airports, industrial zones, and so on and so on. And we use enormous amounts of land for agriculture. So in a nutshell, we have completely reshaped the landscape of our planet. Fortunately, this comes at a great cost. So some of the repercussions of are mentioned here. In the last 50 years alone, we have lost some 2/3 of wildlife populations, and some 1 million species are at this moment threatened by extinction. So we clearly have an ecosystems crisis, but that's unfortunately not the only crisis that we have. Another coinciding development is the rise of global temperature. So these two graphs essentially tell the same thing. The left one goes back 140 years, the right one goes back 170 years, but the story is the same. So as you can see, temperatures in the last 50, 60, 70 years are rising. And last year, together with year 2016, was the warmest year on record. One more note, temperature, of course, is an objectively measurable parameter, so it is difficult to disagree with something as objective as a measurement of temperature, right? There are many consequences of this occurrence of global warming and climate change, so I only have put some pictures representing these consequences here. So at the you have a polar bear who unfortunately has died due to lack of food because the ice has melted. Then we have increasing desertification. Then we have destruction of marine ecosystems, in particular coral reefs. Then we have melting of ice shields on both poles, increasing sea levels. So some of the islands are already unsuitable for human life, although they have been populated for centuries, but due to sea level rise have become unsuitable for living. We see more and more and prolonged heat waves. So temperatures 30, 40 degrees are becoming increasingly common. And the bottom line shows examples of more and more extreme weather. So either in the form of volcanoes, hurricanes, cyclones, forest fires, floods, and so on and so on. So what is important from this slide is this is not something that is going to happen in the future. So this is something that is already occurring and unfortunately increasing in incidence or in occurrence, and sometimes at an alarming rate. Johan Rockström pointed out that in addition to climate crisis that we clearly have in the ecosystems crisis, we clearly have these two relate also to the health crisis. So surely you are aware of the current pandemics that we have. This is the reason why this conference is taking place online. And it seems that the zoonotic virus diseases follow a very similar pattern as the temperature increases. So as you can see from this slide, zoonotic virus diseases are clearly very much on the rise in the last, say, 50, 60, 70, 80 years. And you think that COVID-19 is a bad thing, you are wrong. We are actually very, very lucky that COVID-19 is not something worse. COVID-19 clearly spreads very fast, but luckily the fatality rate is very low, just about around 1%. Some of the viruses that are listed here have a fatality rate of 90%. So out of 10 people that get infected, 9 die. And now imagine a super virus coming that spreads as easily as COVID and has a fatality rate like Ebola, 90%. And I've been listening to a talk by by a natural scientist who's in this area, and he said that this is not a question of if this will happen. So if such a super virus will strike, it's a question when this will happen. Well, hopefully we will not be able to experience this, but if this actually does occur, then we will see what the true problem is. Okay, so we currently have a major problem. We are at risk of destabilizing the Earth system. These two graphs show the development of global temperature for a long time in history. So the left graph goes back 3 million years, the right graph goes back 20,000 years. Now, what you can see from the left graph is that the temperature actually fluctuates quite a bit, but it has stayed within a fairly narrow corridor. So it has never went out from this corridor of +2 and -6 degrees. What we are experiencing now, however, is that very soon, so it might be in a matter of years, or probably not years, but decades, we will probably break the upper limit. So in other words, we are going somewhere where we have never been before. In the right graph, essentially tells the same thing, but this one goes back just 20,000 years. So as you can see, the last major ice age ended some 10,000 years ago. Then that's when the Holocene period started. And what you see at the very end of the Holocene period, so that's last century, it's an explosion of global temperature. So we don't know where we are going. I do not want to speculate what we can expect. I will just show you two quite worrying pictures. First one is a map. So this map shows countries that have different colors, obviously. And natural scientists have established that human beings are not capable of living in areas that where the average annual temperature is about 29 degrees. So when I say average, I mean average. So that includes winter, summer, day and night. 29, that's a very high temperature. So at this point in time, there are only a few places in Africa that are so hot. So this is marked with black color, and you can see some spots in the Sahara Desert that are so hot. However, this may well change in 50 years, and even more so until the end of the century, so by year 2100. And this is marked with this and signposted on the map. And as you can see, and of particular relevance for the audience, since you are mostly Brazilian, as you can see, large parts of Brasilia are denoted as areas that will be unsuitable for human life. So it's difficult to say, but some half or perhaps even more than half of Brazil is designated as such area. Now, from a more holistic perspective, as you can see, the most affected countries lie around the equator, whereas the rich north will not be so badly affected. So it does not mean it will not be affected, but it will be less affected than the, let's say, the poor south. So the northern part of South America, the Central Africa, and the Southeast Asia are the most vulnerable parts to global warming. And the second slide that also shows what might happen to us. These are some graphics. So what might happen if sea levels rise for a few meters. So upper left shows the New York City, upper right London, bottom middle Shanghai. So these cities will be flooded because they are coastal cities. But this is far from being the most pessimistic projection. So here the Parliament building in London, upper right, is still mostly above the water, right? So just the lower parts of the building are flooded. However, in worst case scenario, the entire building might be flooded. So only the towers will stick out from the water. And it is not just cities that are vulnerable, entire countries are vulnerable, in particular countries that are low-lying. So Bangladesh is such an example, very densely populated country, or Netherlands, Europe. Actually, at this present day, roughly half of Netherlands is already below sea level. So they surely are very vulnerable to further rise of sea level. Okay, so we now know we have a problem and we have a major threat. So what is the cause of this problem? We actually know what is the cause. So there is scientific evidence pointing in the same direction. The cause is global greenhouse gases emissions, in particular carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is by far the most important contributor of greenhouse gases emissions. It's not the only one, but the most important ones. And what is very, very worrying, global emissions rose 62% in the last 30 years alone. So below, you have an interesting carbon budget. So this picture represents the evolution of emissions for last 170 years. And as you can see, by far the largest part of emissions come from fossil resources, in particular burning fossil fuels, but also other resources like iron ore, that is carbon-based resource, or limestone, and others. So below, in the bottom part, you see where these emissions go. So the upper part shows the emissions that we, mankind, generate. The lower part shows where these emissions actually end up. So roughly half of it is being absorbed back by our mother nature. And this is split somewhat evenly between the oceans and the land. As far as the land is concerned, forests are particularly crucial in this process. So forests or plants in general. However, forests and the oceans are incapable of absorbing everything that we emit. So roughly half of total emissions end up in the atmosphere. So they're building up in our atmosphere and causing the global warming. I also included this slide, which was actually quite a surprise for me. I always thought the rainforest is the lungs of our planet. So net sink of carbon emissions, as forests typically are. However, recent evidence shows, unfortunately, that the Amazon rainforest is not a net sink, but actually a net emitter of carbon emissions. So I suppose you are more knowledgeable about this because you live in this country that hosts most of the forest, but at least to me, this was very surprising and also worrying, frankly. Okay, so we know the problem, we know the cause. Do we have a solution? Actually, there appears to be a solution, and that solution is imminent and radical reduction of greenhouse gases emissions. The left graph here shows what are the key sources of emissions by sector. And as you can see, the largest contributor is electricity or energy sector, followed by industry, so the manufacturing sector, followed by transport. So transport also is to a large part business, right? So private transport is not business, but much of the transport is also business, in particular freight, but also passenger transport. So collectively, business clearly is by far the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases emissions. If we are to prevent catastrophic climate change, surely you have heard about the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Accord and similar treaties. We should get our planet to net zero in terms of greenhouse gases emissions by 2050, and this leaves us only 29 more years to get to this goal. So frankly, I don't know if that is possible, given that the trend is still going upward. But if we are to save the planet, then we definitely need to take this path of emissions reduction. Okay, so this graph sort of concludes the first section about climate change. It essentially tells the same story as the previous graph. So this is the pathway for different sectors. So all sectors that are listed here, energy, industry, transport, agriculture, buildings, they will seriously need to reduce emissions if we want to get to net zero by 2050. So the key takeouts from this section are as follows. Climate change is a major problem, an even bigger threat for life on our planet. The cause of the problem is greenhouse gases emissions, mankind generated, which are mostly generated by business. The solution to the problem is the radical and imminent reduction of these emissions. So ideally, well, not ideally, we would be carbon neutral tomorrow. That would be ideally, right, tomorrow. But somewhat realistically, maybe carbon neutral by 2050. And business is both the major source of the problem, but also key to its solution. Okay, now we move towards my research in the area. So when I started doing research in this area, I didn't know much actually. Well, there has not been much research also what companies are doing in reality. So one of my first studies was somewhat exploratory. So I investigated what are the climate change mitigation strategies in carbon intensive firms. By carbon intensive firms, I mean simply companies that have large amounts of greenhouse gases emissions, or in particular carbon dioxide emissions. And you might notice that I sometimes use interchangeably terms climate change mitigation and carbon reduction. That's because these are indeed similar terms, but not synonyms. So carbon reduction is definitely the most important part of climate change mitigation, but it is not the only strategy. Right, so carbon capture and storage, for example, is also a viable strategy, although this strategy does not reduce emissions. However, it does capture them and stores them underground. So it is also a climate change mitigation strategy. So given the somewhat exploratory nature of the study, also the research questions were quite exploratory. So what is the usage of distinct carbon reduction practices in carbon intensive firms? And the second question was, what is the relationship between these strategies and practices? So in other words, are they used in complementary manner? So do companies try different strategies simultaneously, or do companies focus on one strategy alone and do not follow different strategies? So this would be more substitution of strategies. So the method for this particular study was survey of 158 European firms participating in the EU ETS. So if you are not familiar what this is, EU ETS stands for European Union Emissions Trading Scheme. And this is by far the largest emissions trading scheme on the planet, and currently includes some 10,000 largest emitters of greenhouse gases emissions in the European Union. It should be noted that installations or emitters in this scheme are not the same as companies, because one company can have several installations, and this is quite common with the big energy firms, right? So large energy firms like E.ON or RWE from Germany can have tens or perhaps up to 100 installations, although it is all within one company or within one group of companies. So this is definitely the population of carbon-intensive firms in European Union, and these 10,000 installations are responsible for roughly half of total emissions in the European Union. This clearly shows that emissions are highly concentrated, right? So we can trace roughly half of total emissions to just 10,000. So before we started with the survey, we developed with my co-author Albert a framework of climate change mitigation strategy. So we devised 3 strategic priorities. First one is internal carbon reduction. This is sometimes referred to as Scope 1 emissions. So meaning that companies reduce emissions within their company. But companies can also reduce emissions elsewhere in the supply chain. So this would be second priority, external carbon reduction, right? So companies don't reduce emissions in-house, but on their suppliers, so downstream, or press on their customers upstream to reduce their emissions. And there's also a third priority. This we label as carbon compensation. So this does not result in actual reduction of emissions, but typically in paying for polluting. But then governments can spend this money generated, right, and reduce emissions elsewhere. So this is the basic idea of the emissions trading scheme. So polluters pay, and this money is spent by governments for reduction of emissions elsewhere. Now, since we were most interested in internal carbon reduction, we then devised or proposed 3 different strategies within this priority. So I will not go into detail, but just briefly mention that there are 2 major types of emissions. So one is combustion. Combustion occurs as a result of burning fossil fuels, right? So in the process of combustion, emissions are released. But then we also have process emissions, which I will now put this a little bit simple way. It's all other emissions, not combustion emissions. So these emissions are common in industries like steel, cement, glass, oil, and some other industries. And these emissions do not occur as a result of burning fossil fuels, but as a result of transforming carbon-based materials, for example, iron ore into steel, or for example, limestone into cement. So for each of these 2 main strategies, obviously there are different carbon practices that are available. I will not go into detail explaining what these practices are, maybe just mention a few. So for example, a typical practice for combustion reduction is switching fossil fuels. For example, natural gas is much cleaner than coal. So same amount of electricity can be generated with far less emissions if natural gas is being used instead of coal. Or increased boiler efficiency. So new boilers can be easily 40–50% more efficient than 40-year-old boilers. As for process emissions, again, there are many different practices that are available. One typical example is using recycled materials. So for example, generating steel from scrap steel is much less carbon intensive than manufacturing steel from iron ore, which is very carbon intensive. Or for example, material substitution. So steel and cement as carbon-based materials can be replaced, for example, by wood that is considered as carbon neutral. And there is also one more strategy, so that's lowering product output. So this is fairly straightforward. For example, if a particular company reduces output, for example, a power plant by 50%, then they will obviously require 50% less coal, and this means that 50% less emissions will be generated. Some of the practices here can also be dysfunctional. For example, if production is merely transferred to another country, this may show up as a reduction in our country or in our company, but if this is merely transferred to another company or another country, then obviously we have done nothing in terms of total emissions reduction. Okay, so let us now see what we have found out. So as I said, this was a survey. So we asked companies what they do, and they needed to indicate on a scale from 1 to 7 the usage of these different practices. So 1 is we don't use it, 7 we use it to a high extent. And as you can see, last 2 columns are most informative. So the mean value and the rank. There is only one practice that scores about the midpoint of the scale. So midpoint is 4. If 1 is lowest and 7 is highest, and that is carbon trading, 4.37. So this is a practice that does not actually directly reduce emissions. This means that companies are simply paying for polluting. And there's only one more that scores at midpoint, so that's general end use efficiency changes, so rank 2. All others practices are used below the midpoint of the scale. Some with an extremely low value, for example, CCS, that before stands for carbon capture and storage. This is a very promising technology. So meaning that carbon is actually released, but it is captured upon release and then stored underground. But this technology is not yet widely commercialized. So it is promising, but not yet commercialized. So this is in line with this, this low usage is in line with this fact. Okay, and the second research question related to strategies. These are the 5 main strategies that were proposed in a slide, two slides back, where we developed the framework. So as you can see, correlations between strategies are fairly low. The only notable exception is external measures strategy that is somewhat correlated with other strategies. However, correlations are not that high. So the only correlation that is sort of in the mediocre range is the correlation between process emissions reduction strategy and the external strategy, 0.5. Other than that, it seems that companies tend to focus on one strategy only, so do not pursue different strategies simultaneously. So the key takeouts from this study were as listed below. Carbon intensive firms still reside firmly in the carbon paradigm, but that was expected. I mean, that's why global emissions continue to rise. We didn't expect anything else. This is just validation. Carbon reduction is actually symbolic. So all the companies claim often how big steps they have made. In reality, it is more or less symbolic. And finally, strategies are not used complementarily, but firms tend to focus on one strategy. Okay, then section 3, this one is more management accounting oriented. It was also published in an accounting journal. So we investigated the role of industry sector in carbon cost structures and carbon reduction strategies. Again, 2 main questions were posited in this study. So what is the moderating role of industry sector on the relationship between positive output and negative output? So you may not be familiar with these terms, positive output and negative output. So positive output is simply products or services, right? Why is that positive? Well, because companies can sell products and services and generate revenues and generate profit, right? That's the purpose of business. However, unfortunately, there are often many side outputs also, in particular pollution and in particular emissions. This output does not have any value for companies, right? They cannot sell emissions, they cannot generate any revenue, any profit, but are highly detrimental for the environment. So that's the reason why I labeled them as negative output. And the second question is somewhat related: how do industry sectors differ in their carbon reduction strategies? So the method here is a triangulation of qualitative and archival data for a sample of Slovenian firms participating in the EU ETS. So this one is more theoretical. compared to the first one, because here we have some rising. So we propose that CO2 emission levels are a function of three variables: volume of output, capacity level, and technology. It is obvious, right? If volume goes up, emissions will typically go up. If capacity goes up, again, typically emissions will go up. And technology is highly important, as I mentioned before. So in carbon paradigm, the best available technology for combustion emissions is burning natural gas in highly efficient boilers, whereas the worst combustion technology is burning lignite in outdated boilers, low efficiency boilers. We divided carbon intensive firms in three sectors, but we did it differently than is done in most other studies. So typically when companies are divided in sectors, they are divided by their product offerings. So for example, car manufacturers, food manufacturers, chemical manufacturers, and so on. But instead, we divided them with respect to carbon resources consumption. So not in terms of product offerings, but in terms of carbon resources consumption. So the first sector is energy. And here we propose that Q clearly is the main driver of emissions, right? So if a thermal power plant generates more electricity, then they must burn more coal, and that clearly drives the emissions, right? More coal, more emissions. The manufacturing sector, we split into two groups. The first one is manufacturing sector transforming carbon materials. These I have already mentioned earlier. Examples typical are steel manufacturing, cement manufacturing, glass manufacturing, and there are also some other less important sectors. So steel is generated from iron ore, cement from limestone, and these materials are also carbon-based, like fossil fuels. So on their transformation, emissions are released in the atmosphere. Now, because these production processes also require heat, this clearly means that these companies generate both types of emissions. So combustion, because they generate heat that is needed in the process, and process emissions that occur upon transformation of, for example, iron ore into steel. So this in effect means that Q and C are drivers of CO2. And finally, we have the manufacturing other sector. So this is manufacturing firms that do not transform carbon-based materials, but can generate significant amounts of emissions simply because they generate heat that is required for the production process. I don't know how this is relevant, how much this is relevant for Brazil, because Brazil, I suppose, is a very warm country. But in Europe, it's much colder, so we actually need to heat our premises for some 7 months a year. And these premises, so buildings or industrial areas or whatever premises we're talking about, are typically heated by burning fossil fuels. So in short, this sector includes more or less all sectors that are not steel, cement, and glass. Okay, the model is also portrayed graphically at the bottom. So what do we find? As I said, this is a triangulation of quantitative and qualitative analysis. So quantitative, we did a panel regression. Second column shows the overall model. And the most important coefficient is coefficient beta. So how is it interpreted? In the overall model, as you can see, the coefficient is 0.12, meaning that 1% change in sales triggers a 0.12% change in emissions. So that's close to zero, right? There seems to be hardly any relationship. However, when we split the total sample into 3 subsamples, so 1 for the energy sector and 2 for the manufacturing sector, we get something completely different. So as you can see in submodel 1, energy sector coefficient beta is exactly 1, so almost exactly 1. So there's a one-on-one relationship between sales change and emissions change. In manufacturing sector that transforms carbon-based materials, so we're talking steel, cement, glass, and similar, this coefficient is 0.62. So 1% change in sales or volume triggers a 0.6% change in emissions. Whereas in submodel 3, that's other manufacturing firms, as you can see, coefficient is very close to 0. It is statistically significant, but the effect size is literally 0, right? And this is something we expected, but we're quite surprised that it holds to such a large extent. So we have also portrayed this graphically, bottom right. And being accountants, you surely will recognize this graph seems somewhat familiar, right? So this is very much like the typical graph of variable and fixed cost, right? So the energy sector, clearly carbon cost is variable. So change in Q triggers change in emissions, whereas in, for example, manufacturing sector that does not transform carbon materials, it is very much like fixed cost, right? So irrespective of Q, emissions stay the same. There was also a qualitative part of this study that is summarized here. So we did mini cases for 6 companies, 2 from each sector. So E stands for energy, MP for manufacturing sector with mixed emissions, so process and combustion, whereas MC stands for manufacturing sector with combustion only. Now, the last 3 columns are very informative. So PO stands for positive output index. I don't recall exactly what was the time period, but I think it was some 5 years. So we calculated the index of sales for a 5-year period. NO stands for emissions. Again, it's an index for the same period. And CI stands for carbon intensity. So it's just a relative number between negative output and positive output. So as you can see, CI, the last column, is below 100 for all 6 companies. So this means that all 6 companies have improved their carbon efficiency or reduced their carbon intensity. However, look at NO column. 4 out of 6 companies have also increased their total emissions. So this can go hand in hand. Companies can simultaneously improve their carbon efficiency and increase their total emissions if the positive output growth offsets efficiency improvements. Efficiency improvements are just a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for emissions reduction. And one more observation that is evident from the middle column about strategies is that strategies are very similar within sectors, but very distinct between sectors. So energy sector, what they do is they are installing efficient boilers and switching fuels. Manufacturing sector with mixed emissions, interestingly, they claim that they cannot tackle process emissions in any way at the current state of technology. Whereas for combustion emissions, they install efficient boilers. In the manufacturing sector that does not transform materials, they claim that they already operate with best available technology, which I mentioned earlier means burning natural gas in highly efficient boilers. So key takeouts from this section is CO2 emissions are variable in energy sector, fixed in manufacturing sector that is not transforming carbon based materials, and mixed in manufacturing sector that is transforming carbon-based materials. And I have already mentioned the homogeneity and heterogeneity. And probably I would need to add here as the key takeout that carbon efficiency improvement is just a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition to reduce total emissions. Okay, so how am I doing in time? We only have a few more minutes, but that's fine. I can finish this in a few minutes. So this study is again more strategy oriented, not so much management accounting. So we investigated here if stakeholder pressures are effective in triggering companies to reduce emissions. So this one is again more theoretical paper. We devised the conceptual model. At the heart of the model is greenhouse gases reduction strategy. And we posit that this has a positive influence on greenhouse gases related performance, and that strategy is influenced by 3 independent variables, either directly or indirectly. So market pressures for reducing emissions, environmental strategy focus. So environmental strategy focus is a much broader construct, right? Because it takes into account all aspects of environmental strategy, whereas greenhouse gases strategy is just one segment of the overall environmental strategy. And perceived environmental uncertainty. Please note that this study was conducted in the context of European Union emissions trading scheme, which is a highly regulated context. However, there are changes that are sometimes occurring, so there is some uncertainty. So the regulator does at some points change the regulation, so there is some uncertainty involved. And what we find that market pressures are influential, so meaning that we as market participants can force or trigger environmentally conscious behavior. Environmental strategy focus does positively influence greenhouse gas related strategy, and greenhouse gases related strategy reduction strategy positively influences performance. Somewhat surprising, we noted that regulatory uncertainty actually has a positive impact on reduction strategy. But again, note, we are talking about a highly regulated context. So it seems that in such contexts, some uncertainty is actually beneficial. And finally, this is ongoing work. So we are still working on the exact research questions. So this is somewhat tentative. We examine how carbon performance indicators mediate the relationship between carbon reduction strategy and organizational outcomes. So this is the conceptual model. At the heart of the model are the 3 constructs in the middle. So carbon reduction strategies, carbon compliance strategies, and emissions performance indicators usage. We have 2 dependent variables, as you can see, organizational benefits and environmental performance. And we have 2 independent variables, resources availability and carbon criteria integration in incentive systems. And the preliminary results are as follows. So blue paths uninterrupted are significant, red interrupted paths are not significant. So we clearly find a positive mediating effect of emissions performance indicators usage. So the direct effects become insignificant. The effects go via the usage of emissions performance indicators. And perhaps even more important, what we see is that carbon reduction strategies actually yield 2 types of benefits. So organizational benefits and environmental benefits, whereas carbon compliance strategies yield no benefits. So neither for the environment, neither for the company. Okay, to conclude, I will show the slide that I often or typically show to my students. So here on your left, you have Lake Bled, which is also in the background that you see of me. So Lake Bled is one of the most beautiful places, not just in Slovenia, but on our planet. All my guests, international guests, are overwhelmed when I take them to see this beautiful lake. So why am I showing this? Climate change research is somewhat special because not only are we explaining phenomena, so that's what typically scientists do, scholars do, explain phenomena, but we also have a power to change our future, right? So we can make changes, we can influence people to change their behavior. And as a human being, not just as a scholar, I think we have an ethical responsibility to leave the planet also roughly in the same state as we have it now to our children, to our grandchildren. And I'm not just talking about precious places like Lake Bled and the Amazon rainforest and many other precious places, but the planet as it is right now, right? So I conclude this discussion, the students, that there is actually a choice, but the students should be taking the initiative, because my generation or generation that is older than me has caused the problem. So it is not really realistic that we will solve the problem. So it is the young generation that is called upon to solve the problem. What I fear, however, is that perhaps we have already gone beyond the tipping point. Some most recent evidence is quite worrying, so that we have perhaps already gone beyond the point of return. So perhaps we don't have the choice anymore. Now, I don't want to end up this in a pessimistic way, but unfortunately, that's how things are. So I guess as a scientist, as a scholar, we also need to be realistic. Thank you. This is all that I wanted to share with you, and I'm looking forward to a discussion.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks very much. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. Thanks for bringing this discussion and showing some of your research on stock. So I think this is a very important talk, and I would say here in Brazil, I feel that Brazil and companies in Brazil have a very important role in this climate change mitigation. And this is a topic that is typically discussed here in terms of external reporting, disclosure of CSR initiatives, and ESG. So it's more explored in terms of external reporting than management control and internal initiatives, as you show us based on your research. And now we will have time for questions. So I will wait some questions pop up at the in chat, and I will transmit them to you. But before that, I would like to start with a question. I would say that you show that companies are, or the way I understood, companies are disclosing some initiatives. They have some discourse in terms of what they are doing or what they intend to do in terms of climate change or environmental initiatives in general. And the way I understood, based on your results, is that this does not necessarily mean that that companies are implementing initiatives internally to do what they are saying or promising to do. In other words, they have a discourse that is not exactly aligned to what they are doing. And then based on that, I was thinking how management control systems could help organizations to better align their discourse to avoid, let's say, some kind of rhetorical talk or cheap talk about environmental initiatives. So this is, let's say, a broad question I would like to ask you about you showed in this final part, the use of performance indicators as a way to do that, but then broadly speaking, how companies could use, or how management control systems could help companies to better align their discourse in terms of environmental initiatives?
Well, the conduct of companies that you have just mentioned is often referred to in literature as greenwashing or impressions management. So what we see often is that companies that are worst polluters tend to portray themselves as most green, and sometimes they even get rewards for being green. But what I have learned from my own research, that there is a major disconnect between what companies are doing in reality and how they portray themselves towards the stakeholders. So sometimes companies that are portraying themselves as most green, as most eco-friendly, are actually companies that do very little or close to nothing. Whereas some companies that perhaps do not really talk that much about themselves may have some very interesting agendas going on and actually do make significant cuts in their emissions. So as for your question, how can management control systems help? Well, I've never, to be honest, been very much interested in this reporting part of accounting. I've always had a great interest for this management accounting part of accounting. In my view, management control systems should help managers to make better decisions. But what they choose to report to the different stakeholders is, in my view, something completely different. So I honestly don't know if we need to find a match between management control systems and what companies actually report to external stakeholders. I could be wrong, so maybe there should be a greater connect, but that's my opinion. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. Let's see if we have questions here. So if you have any questions, you could just type it in the chat, and then I will transmit it to Simon, sorry. Okay. So we have a question here from Claudio Vanderlei. So the question is, do you think that market ESG related pressures will affect management accounting systems? So I don't know if you are able to read the question as well, but then this is a question from Claudio.
Yes, I can read the question. Yes, I think, and this is what we have also showed in our study, that market pressures are influential. So anything that comes from outside the company, it doesn't necessarily have to be market pressures, can also be other types of pressures, I think is influential and will be increasingly influential. Yes, I do think that companies, when they are faced with external pressures, irrespective from where these pressures come, they will align their management control systems, management accounting systems, and try to cope with this pressure. And hopefully this will result in actual reductions of emissions, not just in greenwashing and impressions management initiatives, which is often the case, unfortunately.
So I don't know, this is in Portuguese, but I'm not sure if it is a question to you or to another person. I kind of not sure about that. Let me take the opportunity to ask another question. So related to management control systems again, and when I asked the first question, I was thinking about how companies could stimulate employees' behavior to make decisions that were aligned to their discourse. And so not exactly related to that, but do you think that these, for companies to be able to have a better understanding of their environmental impacts, how do you see the importance of financial and non-financial indicators? So these companies would have to pay more attention to non-financial indicators that are able to capture these initiatives, or they should focus only on financial outcomes. So how do you see this in terms of the design of performance measurement systems?
I think that non-financial performance measures are becoming increasingly important, not just for management accounting purposes, but also for financial accounting purposes, for financial reporting purposes. I don't know if you are aware, in Brazil, but the European Union actually is making some serious steps towards mandatory non-financial reporting, and clearly climate change related indicators will be central in these reports. And we have evidence showing that emissions are actually detrimental also for the market value of companies. So there have been some studies showing that companies that emit more are worth less on the market. So I don't know, but this, I suppose, should be an incentive to for companies to engage in emissions reduction. But for some reason, which I think I know, but I do not want to speculate here, companies reside firmly in the carbon paradigm.
Okay, so let's see if we have questions here. So no questions. Okay, we have a question here from Daniel. So I think we have two questions from Daniel. So
one is about students, if I see correctly.
Yeah, one is related to how environmental strategies are integrated to other companies' strategies, like associated with people, employees, other performance dimensions, let's say. So how this environmental dimension would be integrated to other dimensions. So this is the first part. And then we have the status of academic research on this topic.
Okay, so there are a few questions now.
Yeah, now we have
from Daniel,
Fabio and Riviera.
Yeah, from Daniel. No. So the question for the first part of Daniel's, the answer to the first part of Daniel's question is no, we have not yet investigated how these strategies are integrated to other goals. And how would I evaluate the status of academia in research focusing on CSR practices for management in Europe? Yes, I suppose perhaps that Europe is slightly more advanced in this area than the United States, but I don't think there's a really major difference anymore. So I don't know if there are major differences between continents. Perhaps Europe is slightly more advanced, but this is a very popular topic also in America and Asia. As for Fabio, hi Fabio. So insights, how to prepare new students. Well, I think it is very important that we talk to them about these issues. So they are actually quite knowledgeable. So the topics that I have shared with you today, at least the first section, are often not completely new to them, but to some, they may be an eye-opener. So I think we need to prepare them that they will be the change makers. So it is probably not very realistic that our generation, will make the necessary changes. After all, we have probably contributed much to the problem. So what we need to do is we need to encourage them to take the initiative and to make the changes that are necessary. Because we know what the problem is, we know what the cause is, we know what the solution is. We actually have the technologies. So it is possible to do it, but somebody needs to take the initiative. And then we have Rui.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
also about the implications for accounting education and future professionals.
Yeah, well, I surely agree that solution depends on everybody working together. So politics, companies, and individuals, we need to work together. And how can we as individuals pressure things to change where we are actually quite powerful as customers? So if we, for example, refuse to buy products or services that, for example, are not produced in eco-sustainable way, then I can guarantee you that companies will start making changes. So as customers, we are powerful, definitely not each single one of us, but if we move together, right? So if we start making decisions together, then I am 100% confident that companies will start making changes. And what about teaching? Yes, I do agree that management accounting should be changed. So the way it is taught. So what we teach today is still very much the same as management accounting was taught some 50 years ago. I don't think there are many environmentally related topics in management accounting textbooks, although this is probably the most important topic that will need to be addressed in the near future. So I agree. There's much we can do also in management accounting.
So I think this is our final question. I assume we are running out of time. And again, I would like to thank you very much, Simon, for your speech, for bringing this discussion, for sharing with us your research in this very interesting and this very important talk. We appreciate very much, and we look forward to seeing you here in Brazil next time and having the chance to talk personally. So thank you very much.
Thank you too for inviting me, and I definitely hope that sometime we will also meet in person.
Okay, so I don't know what we have to do now.